This is Force for Hire,
a deep dive into private military contracting and how it's transforming the battlefield.
I'm Michelle Harvin.
And I'm Desmond Ferris.
You may have heard about a Russian contractor company called the Wagner Group. They've been brought up a couple times by guests on this show. And that's because Moscow has increasingly turned to the use of contractors in its global interests. There have been reports of the Wagner Group in places like Syria, Ukraine, Central Africa, among other places. Wagner isn't Russia's only PMC, but they've certainly been the most reported on. And these groups make for some riveting, old-school mercenary accounts. That's because they take on more of an active combat role, and why some have called them a private army.
To this day, the Kremlin denies the existence of Wagner or any Russian state-supported private armies. But it became harder to deny after Russian contractors came head-to-head with U.S. forces in Syria in a 4-hour battle in February of last year. It resulted in a U.S. airstrike estimating to have killed around 100 contractors. But as Wagner and other Russian PMCs quietly make their way into more spots around the globe, there are still many questions about how they operate and whether their operations could lead to more armed confrontation between American and Russian forces.
So to learn more, we brought in Sergey Sukhankin, a research fellow at the Jamestown Foundation and a lecturer at McEwan University and the University of Alberta. We started the conversation talking about Russia's historical use of covert PMCs.
Well, if we go back to history, we'll see that the Soviet Union, while confronting the United States and the West in Africa and Latin America, so they were employing so-called Soviet military advisors or military instructors, which today might be seen as members of quasi-PMCs. Back then, this was an integral part of the Soviet armed forces, but of course they were clandestine. They started from the collapse of the USSR until relatively, until 2009. This period was characterized by the fact that Russia itself was undergoing quite a difficult historical interim, and in many ways this was a haphazard transformation, haphazard experience. For example, if we take a look at Russia's so-called volunteers that operated in the Balkans, in Transnistria, in South Caucasus, it was a very peculiar combination of proto-PMCs or mercenaries and true volunteers. For example, Mr. Girkin Strelkov, he was one who fought on the Balkans and later would transfer his knowledge upon the outbreak of the Ukrainian crisis.
Why do you think it's important to understand the historical significance of PMCs, to understand today's modern version of PMCs in Russia?
Yeah, well, because this is an apparent continuity and tradition in terms of Russia's use of private military contractors. In fact, we cannot call those entities that we see today, like the Wagner Group or the Yenot, or before that Slavonic Corps Limited, as PMCs. They are basically either private military contractors or private armies. But again, the operative principles are something that they learned on the Balkans, in Transnistria, in other regional conflicts. It's still there.
So you brought up Wagner. Why don't we go into that? Can you explain what is the current Russian group known as Wagner?
From my research, from what I've been doing, I have come to the conclusion that the Wagner Group is in fact a special project of the GU, or the main directorate of the General Staff of the Armed Forces. And it was first used on the territory of Luhansk Oblast when it crossed the border in May 2014 as two tactical groups. In fact, the Ukrainian chapter of the Wagner Group was the most decisive one. It basically signified this transformation from some hybrid entity into a quasi-private military army, sort of private military group. Because in Ukraine, what they did, they performed various tasks ranging from military and paramilitary activities to reconnaissance, intelligence collection, sabotage. So basically, it was Ukraine that contributed to creation of the Wagner Group.
Why does Russia use these, as you say, quasi-paramilitary or quasi-PMCs?
Yeah, in other words, mercenaries, right?
Right.
And in 2011, we saw emergence of the first Russian PMC, the so-called Moran security group. And in 2012, the head of the Moran, Boris Chikin, he actually, after the episode with the Marai sea diver affair, when the Russian vessel that belonged to Moran was detained by the Nigerian authorities, he actually said that, well, we've got nothing here. We cannot compete with Western PMCs because the whole world, as he said, was divided between Western PMCs. And the next move they did was this creation of the Slavonic Corps Limited, and which signified this attempt to change the rules of the game because Russia was unable to play by these rules on the world PMC market. And this was an attempt. Russia was a clear underdog, and it was trying to change the unfavorable environment by sort of using the drawbacks, the minuses that Russian quasi-PMCs had for their advantage. So this is reason number one. Basically, in order to become a player in the realm, in this environment of PMCs, Russia had to do something original. And in other words, to use PMCs not like classical Western PMCs, but like private armies. So this is reason number one.
So it's like a competitive advantage.
Yes, absolutely. Because again, Russia could not play by the rules. It did not have, this influence. It did not have this reputation. So what they could do, they could try to change the rules of this game.
Have they been? I mean, we've seen the Wagner Group in a good amount of areas now. Has this competitive advantage worked?
Well, I guess yes. If we take a look at Africa, for example, we'll see that the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, other places, their dictators, their political leadership is quite interested in cooperating with the Russians for one main reason. Russian PMCs officially, they don't exist. So there is zero accountability for their activities.
And how does Wagner stay under the radar? How do they not get accountability? How are they doing this? Because they are working with governments. It would seem that their actions would be taken into account by journalists, by groups on the ground.
Well, one of the main reasons is that they don't exist on paper. So officially, they don't exist, and this grants the Russian side the so-called plausible deniability. So they can send those people to work in Ukraine, in Syria, in the Middle East, in Africa, but there is zero accountability for their actions because, as you've heard, all Russian officials are saying when asked about Wagner or other private military contractors, the kind of answer they have, well, we don't have PMCs.
Let's explore Africa for a second. Can you talk about how Russian mercenaries are making their way to Africa?
Well, again, these are just theories because we don't have much information on that. We know for certain that in the CIR, they were invited by the president, something that both the African side and the Russian side have confirmed. So they are, at least what's on the surface, the Russian military advisors, how they call them, they are present in the CIR by the invitation of the local political elite.
It's interesting that they can deny it so much because we had last year U.S. commandos fight a four-hour battle with Russian mercenaries who were working with pro-Syrian government forces. Did this bring anything to light, or did this make even American forces consider Wagner as a serious threat?
Well, in fact, it didn't bring anything to light except for three main things. First of all, it actually confirmed that the Wagner Group, it does exist, because before that, those were just rumors. Now we know for certain that they do exist, and they're operating in Syria, and they have been operating in Syria since at least 2015. And this shows that whenever the Russian side says we are not there, it should be read vice versa. So basically, it's one conclusion that could be drawn. Secondly, is that the Wagner Group is primarily effective against poorly trained and technologically weaker opponent. And this could be, and I think it has been considered by the Russian armed forces, so it could be sort of a lesson for the Russian armed forces that weakness in technologies, and especially in drones, could have serious repercussions for or in scopes of a conflict that could be waged against technologically stronger opponent. And thirdly, the Wagner Group, from where I stand, again, the third conclusion that we could make is that the Wagner Group is an easily disposable cannon fodder that the Russian side can use whenever and wherever it wants, without any repercussions.
Yeah, and who are these fighters then, if they're being used as cannon fodder?
Well, a typical person, a typical portrait of a typical PMC or quasi-PMC member is a middle-aged man, somewhere between 35 and, the upper boundary is about 50 years of age, usually from the Russian provinces. The majority of them, approximately up to 90%, they either were involved or had previous military experience. Many of them could not find themselves in civilian lives. So basically, aside from economic interests, they feel isolated in civilian life. So this combination makes them go and pursue their interests, make money abroad, engaging in those groups and those kind of groups.
You mentioned that a lot of what we know is due to investigative journalists. We had a situation in July where 3 Russian journalists were killed in the Central African Republic while investigating the Wagner Group. Can you talk about the significance of this event?
Well, it's not just one event. Actually, we had Maxim Borodin, a person who was investigating the Wagner Group, who accidentally fell out a window and died. So basically, we have a number of cases when people who were digging or trying to dig deeper have been either prosecuted or ended up being dead. So this shows that the Russian side is involved in the regions, in Africa, in other regions, and this is a clear message that those who will try to dig deeper and apparently go to the theater might end up as those 3 journalists that you mentioned.
And how do Wagner or the other Russian groups pursue Moscow's interests?
Well, I would say that there are 3 main areas why Moscow is interested in employing these groups. First of all, it's geopolitical element. So basically, it secures a Russian presence in zones of confrontation without direct participation. In other words, plausible deniability. So as we can see, Russia is using those groups to increase its presence, to increase its influence in other regions, not just Ukraine or Syria. It's the Central Africa, probably Latin America, and other regions. Second important moment is geostrategic or geoeconomic moment, which allows Russia to make war a profitable enterprise, something that the Soviet Union lacked. Today, Russia is trying to use private military contractors as a force that secures Kremlin's and some specific individuals' economic interests.
And so we know that they're not working against the Kremlin's interests, but how closely are they working together? Or do we have a sense of who's in charge?
Well, I think that there is a consortium of actors that is in charge, or who are in charge. It's obviously Russia's Ministry of Defense, because without them, nothing is basically possible in Russia. The second player, the second element is the above-mentioned GU, because if we take a look at Wagner's training techniques and their polygon that is located in Molkino, Krasnodar Krai, which belongs to GU actually, this shows that the Wagner Group, its activities are not just agreed on, but also might be supervised by the GU. And I think that the general staff, because from the information that we have from 2010, it was actually the general staff that would first express its interest in integrating of similar companies, similar enterprises in the structure of Russian armed forces.
What we talked about before is that Wagner is not the only Russian mercenary group. Can you talk about sort of the economy of Russian private military contracting, or how many groups we are aware of, or how many we can guess are operating?
I think that the number of groups, well, there are different theories about that. Some scholars, some practitioners, some experts say that there is more than 10 groups. I think that the maximum limit is up to 10 groups. From what we know, there are also PMC MAR. There is the Yenot PMC, which was disbanded in 2019, but frankly speaking, I don't believe that it was disbanded. An extremely interesting case study is the Yenot PMC. This is sort of a group, or again, quasi PMC, of course, that was quite active during Russia's annexation of Crimea, then during the outbreak of instabilities and the ensued war on the Ukrainian southeast. What's interesting about this group is that they're, aside from paramilitary activities, they're also training Russia's youth and international youth. One of the most notorious affairs was the Zlotibor affair, when the military patriotic camp for the youth was closed down by Serbian police. And Yenot PMC was actually in charge of the training procedures. And what was known later was that all this affair was supervised by the Russian Ministry for Foreign Affairs and by the local authorities in Serbia. So one of the main trends, one of the main features that we can see among Russian paramilitary contractors is that they're trying to also expand their control on various youth groups.
Yeah, and I think that is interesting that this is something that the youth may be getting wrapped up in more and more.
Yeah, yes, obviously, because today what we see in Russia is that there is a clear trend toward militarization of Russian youth. And those who are not fit for state-sponsored enterprises, state-sponsored movements, they could easily become affected. They could easily be drawn by these PMCs. So again, it's quite disturbing, quite worrisome tendency.
And you had mentioned economic reasons.
Yeah.
Can you go into that a little bit more?
Yeah, this is something that we've seen in Syria. Actually, the Wagner Group was decimated in 2018, in the early 2018, when they were reportedly trying to seize their control over the local oil fields and the infrastructure. So what we know for certain is that Russia is using its PMCs to establish control over oil and natural gas reserves and resources that are were controlled either by the Kurds or by other formations. So this was one of the main reasons. Same thing in Africa. What we know for certain is that either the Patriot PMC or the Wagner Group, they're trying to control the deposits of diamonds, gold, other minerals.
And what do you see happening in the future with either Wagner or another Russian quasi-military group? What do you see as a potential for the future?
Well, I think that on the basis of what we have seen is that, well, as I said, the Russian side is quite happy about their performance, even though there have been some, drawbacks, and the fact that the number of people who are actually willing to join this quasi PMCs is quite high. So the pool of people is large. I think that the idea of these groups, it will persevere, and I think we should expect proliferation of their activities, probably even beyond the actual spheres.
When we return, our next guest will help us dive into PMC culture in Africa and much more.
Stay informed on all the news that matters most to the military community with a subscription to Stars and Stripes Digital Access. As a subscriber, you'll enjoy unlimited access to the Stripes.com website and our Stars and Stripes mobile apps, updated 24/7 by reporters stationed at military bases around the globe. Subscribe today and enter the promo code PODCAST when signing up for a yearly subscription and receive 50% off your first year. Get exclusive access to special features, interactive articles, award-winning photography, and more. Visit stripes.com/digital and enter the promo code PODCAST to subscribe today. As Sergey mentioned, one of the significant places Russian PMCs can be found today is in Central Africa. And Africa is no stranger to military contractors and private security. From Sierra Leone's government employing a mercenary group to restore order, to South Africa's modern private security industry, there is a storied past with PMCs. So we wanted to talk more about what Russian contractors are doing in Africa, and also about Central Africa's relationship with the industry. For that, we brought on Peer Schouten.
So my name is Peer Schouten, actually pronounced in the correct way in Dutch, that would be Peer Schouten. I'm a senior researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies, which is an independent research institute in Denmark. And I'm also an associate researcher at the International Peace Information Service, a Belgian research organization into conflict in Central Africa.
If we want to set some barriers for where we're talking about here, what are the places in Africa that you focus on?
So I currently work mostly in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the DRC, also known as the Congo, not to confuse it with the Little Congo, Congo-Brazzaville, which is its tiny western neighbor. And then besides the DRC, I also work in the Central African Republic a lot for my ongoing research, and in the South Sudan.
And so recently we're seeing Russian contractors in many of these places. Can you talk about how that's impacting the communities there? Yeah,
well, I can certainly give you a bit of a on-the-ground perspective on that, because I've been to the Central African Republic quite a few times over the last few years, and I know a lot of people there, and I know their perceptions of foreign engagement in the country, and in order to understand what the kind of presence of the Wagner Group means for Central Africans today, you need to understand how they look at the French. The Central African Republic used to be a French colony and was part of what the French used to call La France-Afrique, French Africa. And in a way it still is, because most of the most important business sectors, formal business sectors, are still in the hands of French. Like the sugar import business is run by a French company. So these companies have monopolies on the most important products, and the French used to have also on the highest level of government advisors for anything from security to tax regimes, of course, for French imports and exports, and any other kind of matter which would touch upon the French national interest in the region. But over the last few years, France has found it difficult to maintain an interest in a country which has lost much of its strategic interest, was falling apart because of internal conflict. The government only controls 30% of the national territory right now. And by kind of withdrawing from the highest echelons of power in the Central African Republic, disengaging, it has left an opportunity, a kind of void for anyone who was interested to kind of step into. Now, the French didn't expect, actually, that someone would step into that place. And what Central Africans, how they see it now, is that the Russians are trying to get into the same kind of position as the French used to be, by placing advisors in the country on the highest level of strategic decision-making, which is, of course, military advisory and military training services, as a way into also getting concessions in important economic sectors in the country.
And let's talk about the Congo then, because there's also a historical significance of military contracting there. Can you go into that?
So there's a lot of interest recently in private security companies, mercenaries, new state actors which somehow have a legitimate or legal mandate to perform security services we usually associate with the state. But if you go back into history, about a century or so, maybe a little bit longer, you find that actually this distinction between public and private security didn't really make sense at all. In places like Congo, colonization was done on the cheap, which means that kind of semi-public ventures such as colonial states were actually carried out by private mercenaries or hired guns, local armed bands, all the time. So that it was very difficult to distinguish between what was actually public and which was private. So this kind of historically then the distinction between the public and private doesn't make sense to look at security governance if you move back down from, say, the 1900s down in history.
And so that now we have a sort of background. What are the Western actors working in that area today, or what's that modern security structure look like?
Right. So if you want to understand the kind of private security sector today in the DRC, in the Congo, what you really need to do is you need to look at the mining industry and at aid organizations. The Congo is a vast country. It's about as big as Western Europe, but it has very little modern infrastructure. And the only infrastructure which is again in place is probably linked to the mining industry, which has to kind of provide for its own roads, sometimes railways, and you find huge extractive enclaves which cannot rely alone on the security that the public security apparatus in Congo can provide. And actually when President Kabila, also referred to as Musée, the first President Kabila, came into power in 2001 in the context of civil war, he wanted to attract private investors, mainly in the extractive industries, by making it possible for them to actually legally hire and bring with themselves private security companies to protect their operations.
And you mentioned this, but it sounded like this was something that through your research, you were very surprised upon seeing how aid organizations in the Congo work with contractors.
If you travel through the Eastern Congo right now, or South Sudan for that matter, what you find is really a landscape which is a bit dystopic or dystopian, if you will. Because anytime you encounter an aid organization, what you'll find is actually a kind of bunkerized, barbed-wired installation, which doesn't at all breed anything like aid, outreach, or engagement with the local population, but more one of fear. And for the local population, many of the aid kind of compounds look the same as mining industries, whereas you would expect that their engagement with the population around them would be premised on a totally different logic. The way that they actually behave outwardly is looks very much the same. So, however different their missions and objectives, because they make use of the same private security contractors and the same type of security managers in contexts like the DRC and South Sudan or Central African Republic, aid organizations and mining companies start to look the same in the way that they behave towards local populations. And I think it's legitimate to ask questions whether this is the way that we think as perhaps tax-paying audiences in the West, whether this is the kind of way that we want to be perceived in these countries.
This may be a distinction that doesn't quite matter or gets very muddy, but I was wondering, in the DRC or the places that you look at, are we looking at military contracting groups or are these private security groups?
I think it's a really good question. I think that the distinction is increasingly difficult to maintain. Yes, sure, there's still a number of mercenary-like private military company outfits out there, but most of those kind of companies, which started perhaps out as more ad hoc, scrambled together organizations of a few former soldiers put into a private security uniform have professionalized over the years, and their bosses have started to wear ties, and they engage in much more day-to-day kind of security services like static security, advisory, etc. And to make the distinction even thinner, even if a company would be a foreign private security company like South African working in the Congo, in order to provide effective security, they will need very intimate ties with the people who actually determine security on the ground. And those are often the Congolese generals, sometimes even warlords, in the area of operation of mining companies and aid organizations. So you see that the links between public and private security in practice are indeed very, 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 very thin and narrow. And in order to provide efficient private security, you need to have very tight links with public security officials. At least that's what they are on paper, right?
I did read a take that because troops and security left Middle East, Africa became sort of the new cash cow for contracting companies. Is that a fair assessment?
It is. I mean, this is a private sector, which means that it's driven by business logics. And if you're interested in having a product to sell, you, in principle, would, of course, like to have unlimited demand. Now, the concept of security itself, what is security? When are you secure, right? It's so ephemeral that you can always kind of fill it out in ways that you're actually never secure, right? Is security the absence of something concrete? Is it a feeling? Is it if you have certain measures in place? And I think that the private security industry has really cashed in on this comparative advantage of having something to sell, which is in principle limitless. Your clients can always feel insecure, and in part you actually might be selling this feeling of insecurity to your clients to generate more demand. And what is definitely a tendency, though, is that many of the private security companies that you see now in Africa are spin-offs of the kind of organizations which came with the American invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, and who thrived on the kind of DoD contracts they could get there, and suddenly found themselves out of work over there and then started to look for new markets. So the kind of spread of terrorism across Africa that we're witnessing, unfortunately, today is definitely something of a business opportunity of greenfield markets, so to say, for these kind of organizations.
And I wanted to ask if you've seen any examples of how contracting can work well in the Congo or any of the other areas you focus on?
So however much I might be critical of the privatization of security as a kind of analytical problem, right? Besides that, I do think that private security is actually a brilliant economic sector in conflict-affected countries or economically underdeveloped countries, because what they actually do is they provide low income but kind of stable jobs for youth. Africa is a continent where 60% of the population is under the age of 25. I mean, a big part of the problem is that these unemployed youth might also refer to criminality, violence, joint armed groups, etc. And I think that in creating this demand for more and more security by the aid industry, the mining sector, and increasingly also other private sectors, it has created a lot of demand for young guys to actually take on this uniform, stand in front of a gate, and make this kind of monthly salary. So in that sense, I think it's the best example of a private sector growth in very volatile and unstable areas.
Thanks to Sergey Sukhankin and Peer Schouten for talking with us for this episode. Next time, we'll be hearing from Chris Hoare, the son of Mad Mike Hoare, one of history's most well-known soldiers of fortune. His father led mercenary forces during the Congo crisis and led an attempted coup in the Seychelles.
There were thousands of nuns and priests in the Congo, and after Stanleyville had fallen to Mike's mercenaries and the Belgian paratroopers towards the end of 1964, the government asked Mike to please go and rescue the nuns and priests all around the Stanleyville area.
Don't forget to subscribe, and while you're there, leave us a review. You can also let us know your thoughts at podcast@stripes.com. Also, follow us on Twitter for updates at Stars and Stripes.
Force for Hire's supervising editors are Bob Reed and Terry Leonard. Digital team lead and editor is Michael Darnell.
Thanks for listening.
This is Force for Hire.